When you're dealing with a missing persons case, there's an expression in law enforcement, JDLR, just doesn't look right. And the Miramar police have been looking for a missing woman.
I've never seen any police agency try to pull what Miramar pulled in this case.
Their investigation leads them to a field that is strewn with junk. This field is going to be searched. They're going to use cadaver dogs. When they release the dogs, there's a 55-gallon drum laying on its side in the middle of this field. The dogs make a beeline for it, and they alert when they reach it. Police are going to have to open this drum, and what they find inside is going to be horrifying.
My name is Detective Danny Smith with the Miramar Police Department. I studied psychology in college, and my intent was to get my foot in the door in law enforcement at a local agency, do a few years there, and then move on to the FBI. And oddly enough, while I was at the Miramar Police Department, I just loved it so much, there's no way that they were going to be able to take me out of it. It's been 14 years, and personally, with this case, it's something that will haunt my memories for the rest of my life. I remember specifically being in our office's homicide unit and having these missing person detectives come in and just pull us aside and go, hey, this is what we have. It's a little bit weird. What do you guys think?
The Miramar Police Department has a missing persons case of a 35-year-old woman named Lisa Spence.
I'll take a look at it. All right.
Lisa's family, they called. They were very vocal in saying there's something that's just not right here.
When a missing persons case is assigned, you first need to determine background of the missing person. Is this someone who's distraught about something and decides to start a new life? Or did some harm come to her?
Your very first step is to go to the people that are closest to them. In this case, the people that were close to her were family, and they were far away. They weren't in South Florida. I was able to speak with Lisa's daughter.
Hello? Lisa Spence is from Trinidad. She and her boyfriend, Paul Edwards, met in 2006 in Trinidad and came to South Florida sometime after that. So she's here, she's with him.
From what we've gathered from the family, she was just a very caring person. She had a great relationship with her family, great relationship with her kids. Coming here wasn't something that, she did easily. She was leaving behind her children, but this was an opportunity for a better life. Not only for her, but for her kids. She felt that she could earn more money here and eventually, bring them over here.
She routinely sends money and property back to Trinidad to support those people, using the most common method used for this, which is 55-gallon drums, because many of the transport ships between Florida and the Caribbean islands are barges. So by using a 55-gallon drum, you are secure in the fact that it's a watertight seal.
Lisa was very close with her daughter. They were more friends than mother-daughter. They really spoke to each other often and shared in each other's lives constantly. She said that on October 7th, Lisa had called her daughter and explained that she was getting off of work soon and she's going to call her when she gets home. That call never came.
All of a sudden, she's disappeared in a puff of smoke.
Fast forward to October 10th, she still didn't call her daughter, and she didn't call any members of her family. The pinnacle of that suspicion came when her daughter turned 18, and Lisa never called her daughter to say happy birthday. She missed her 18th birthday.
That's not just a red light, that's a solar flare. There could only be one reason that she didn't call home, and that is that she couldn't.
We went worst case scenario in our minds. So it was a no-brainer at that point to just kind of dig your heels in and start working it. My partner, John Zeller, and I started working the case.
I've worked a few missing persons cases that turned into a homicide, and this one just had all the elements for it.
The idea of the investigation is obviously to go speak with everyone that's closest to Lisa and then work your way out. Paul Edwards, her live-in boyfriend at the time, would be the number one person that we'd want to go talk to and get an idea of where Lisa could be.
So when they meet Paul Edwards, Edwards says that he has been with this woman for 9 years.
Are you guys considered married or?
We're not married.
Paul Edwards thought the two had a rocky relationship.
We've had our fights.
Edwards says they've been fighting a lot, arguing a lot.
Since like Labor Day weekend, we've been back and forth as to her leaving and stuff like that because of some issues that we had.
He told us that their relationship fell apart and Lisa said she wanted to leave.
He was hopeful she would change her mind.
I said, I'm gonna give you your space so you can do your thing. So I left. I left the apartment. When I came back, stuff was gone. So it was disappointing because of the fact that you tried so many years to make some things right and it just didn't pan out that way.
He loved her, but she apparently had fallen out of love with him. Then he mentions that he really has the sense that Lisa had a secret part of her life.
Did she keep a lot of secrets from you?
I think she's someone that, how should I put it? She can lock up if she wants to.
Can he shut you out?
Yeah.
He suggested that Smith speak to her coworkers, and perhaps they would know more than he.
Lisa Spence worked 2 jobs at a beauty supply store and then at a small convenience store.
I think you have to understand that Lisa didn't have family here, so her outlet was her coworkers. These were the people that she had around that she can talk to, that she can vent to.
Coworkers love gossip. They engage in it as a sport. They particularly enjoy the dirt, so they're an excellent source of information.
Okay, in reference to your employee, Lisa, how long has she been helping you out here at the store?
Maybe a year and a half.
Has she ever been away this long?
No, she never disappeared like that.
Her boss had mentioned that he had a check ready for her. However, she never picked up that check, and that to him was not common for her.
There is no way she would have left without picking up her last paycheck.
It was just odd.
When Smith meets with the coworkers, he encounters the same general sense from these people. They're worried that something awful has occurred. He speaks to them further. What else do you know about her? And he gets a very interesting answer from more than one of the coworkers.
She told me she has a new boyfriend.
Most of them were talking about this other guy that Lisa just started dating. She was really into him.
When we see her new boyfriend, we got shocked.
Did you ever meet Lisa's new boyfriend?
I met him here in the store when he comes.
And the coworkers say that this fellow comes to see her every day. Really? That's more than somebody that needs to buy a pack of chewing gum now, isn't it?
When hearing about another guy that was in her life, now the number one person that we'd want to go talk to.
Well, now we have the possibility of a new live-in boyfriend. Perhaps this is the secret side of Lisa's life that Paul Edwards was wondering about. So does Lisa Spence have a secret love interest? And it led her to seek a new love nest to live in? It's possible. But one cannot overlook the fact that there's still a concern that she's no longer alive. What exactly is going on?
Once we started asking questions about this new boyfriend, we were able to track down who that person was.
The coworkers explained his name is Max Lewis.
We were able to touch base with him and get some information from him.
Do you remember when the last time was that you spoke to Lisa? Yeah, I spoke to her last Wednesday night when she was at work. She called me, I spoke to her on the phone. Never heard from her since.
I'm gonna speak to someone, and I assume they're lying to me about everything until I can somehow either be convinced that they're not lying or I can prove that they're being honest.
How serious was your relationship?
We got serious a few months ago.
Okay. Did you guys plan on moving in together?
Listen to me, bro. Listen to me carefully. We were supposed to get married. You understand?
He had mentioned that even though they had only been dating for probably less than a month, he wanted to marry her.
Max implies that she wanted to marry him, but he never really admits that she said those words. Interesting. Jealousy is a very powerful thing. What if Lisa says, I'm done with you? No, you're not. I'm going to see to it that you no longer love anyone, because you're going to die right here and right now.
I think that reading people as an investigator is somewhat of a lost art.
Do you remember about what time that was?
In the case of this new boyfriend,
Did you leave the house at all for the rest of the night?
I threw everything at him that I possibly could to try to get him off his game.
Okay, and then on Thursday, the next day.
And to his credit, he was completely honest with me, in my opinion.
Do you remember what you did that day?
He did tell us where he was that night that Lisa went missing, and we were able to confirm that through the cell phone records.
In this case, it corroborated that he was not in the area. We ruled him out as a suspect.
So Smith has to ponder all of this. This is what he's learned so far. We still have no evidence of a crime. So what does that matter? Well, maybe Lisa's alive.
People will often ask me if finding Lisa was like finding a needle in a haystack, and I say no. Lisa was like trying to find a needle in a stack of needles.
So Smith is sitting there stewing in this mess, trying to decide how to proceed. I've been there, and it's ugly. But one of her brothers, who lives in this country, comes forward.
I have a text from my sister.
We were informed by Lisa's brother that he was receiving text messages from his sister. You know, this is after she went missing. It was strange to us because, hold on, is she truly missing or she's not missing?
The texts say that Lisa Spence has moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and that she's fine and she's going to work on getting herself together and so on. Jacksonville and Miramar are at opposite ends of the state of Florida.
There was a moment of hope. There was a part of me, of course, that was hoping that it was correct and Lisa really was in Jacksonville and she was fine.
But her brother says, you know, this is really unusual. She didn't like to text.
She would call you if she wanted to speak to you, and that right there was suspicious to him. And his words, that's not Lisa. She didn't send these texts.
Something didn't smell right. We want to get to the bottom of this. We want to ensure that either she's alive and kicking or she's not, and either or we'll deal with it as it comes.
So at that point, we ended up doing a cell site court order. We wanted to get Lisa's cell sites to see if her device actually was in Jacksonville.
Where is this happening at? Okay, is it happening in Jacksonville? Is it happening in Miramar? Is it happening in California? Is it happening in Trinidad? We're looking at also the cell sites. We could tell that the phone was nowhere even close to Jacksonville.
In fact, her phone had never left the area of Miramar, South Florida.
Lisa's phone wasn't in Jacksonville. and neither was Lisa.
We're trying to put together a puzzle, and we ultimately bring that back, the relationship between Paul and Lisa.
So Smith keeps talking to people and friends of hers, associates from work. The only thing she talks about is how much she is unhappy with Paul Edwards.
Mainly her close friends would tell us, independent of one another, that it was an abusive relationship.
Did she ever tell you that he hits her or anything like that?
I've heard stories that they have been abused.
There was physical violence from Paul to Lisa.
He hit her and she called me.
That's something that you just can't look past.
So it is apparent of your choices available as a suspect in the disappearance of this woman. Paul Edwards rises to the top. So if Mr. Edwards did this, how would he dispose of the remains? A car. The problem with that theory is Edwards doesn't own a car.
While we were digging around, we learned that Paul had a car rented to him.
Is that a coincidence? No one in the homicide business believes in a coincidence.
We were able to track down the rental car that he had already turned in, and we wanted to do a complete search for any evidence, forensic, hair, blood, anything that we could find.
He hopes to find something in that car that will tie Edwards to the disappearance of this woman.
It was a little bit of a nightmare for the investigation, at least for me in my own head, because I realized that rental car companies will clean the cars.
So the forensic team pores over it. For hours, they look everywhere.
I didn't think that we were going to find anything of value, but we're still going to give it all we've got.
That's what good policemen do. They don't assume failure, they assume victory.
We got lucky. We found a smear of blood in the rear of the vehicle.
Now, they have no DNA from Lisa Spence, but they have human blood in a rental car. Is that damning evidence? No, but it's something. It's a beginning. Now, they have enough to get a search warrant for the Edwards home.
When we went into that house, I was cautiously optimistic. I was hoping that we would see that there was evidence of a major crime scene.
Something, anything that would tell us what happened here. At first glance, it looked like a normal home.
I was a little disappointed.
So now we do a thorough search of the bathroom, and they find something under the vanity.
It was a small mark of blood that was underneath the bathroom vanity. The location was interesting because it's not normally a place that you would find blood if you cut your finger in the bathroom or something along those lines. And it actually had directionality.
The direction of that splatter is from the floor upward under the vanity. It is cast-off stain, cast-off from an instrument. Could be a bludgeon, could be a knife. It's likely that something horrible has happened to Lisa Spence, and it happened right here in Paul Edwards' bathroom. It is a sad fact of humanity that love and murder tie together nicely. Love produces emotion, emotion produces murder.
The best piece of evidence I think that we got from that house was blood evidence in the bathroom. That it came from below the vanity to above really shed some light on the fact that this could possibly be a crime scene.
If Smith's instincts are correct, Lisa Spence died in her own home. Who else is in this home? Paul Edwards. he has emerged as suspect number one in this case.
But we couldn't just go and put handcuffs on him. There was no way to get any kind of DNA from a toothbrush, from a stick of deodorant, a hairbrush. Everything that belonged to Lisa was out of that house at that time.
We still have no DNA. There is no body that's been found. So they have circumstantial evidence only, and it's insufficient to proceed to an arrest. But if Lisa Spence is no longer alive, the texts that her brother received from her cell phone were apparently texted from her grave, or texted by someone else who had her phone.
Does Paul have her phone? We need to follow up with that.
Detective Zeller of the Miramar Police Department.
My partner, Detective Zeller, he excels in technology and finding information through electronic sources.
So he obtains the phone records of Paul Edwards.
Take a look at this.
I had plotted Paul Edwards' cell sites. I also plotted Lisa Spence cell sites. And I noticed that there was a lot of tower hits with both phones at the same time. That was weird.
We were able to see that Lisa's phone and Paul's phone were traveling in the same areas, basically mirroring each other.
And this is all after she went missing.
Getting the phone records was a big light bulb moment. I looked at the information and I said, I'm 99% sure that Paul's driving around with Lisa's phone. For me, that's concrete. I look at that and say, that's written in stone, that's what happened. Now, court's a different story.
There is no body that's been found. It's a missing persons case, and that's all it is right now. Instinct won't get it done. Judges don't want to hear about your instinct. It's proof beyond any doubt. He doesn't have that yet.
At this point in the investigation, we all hit a dead end. We didn't know what else we could do to try to generate either tips or evidence or Lisa.
What can we do to rattle Edwards' cage and make him move around and maybe show them where Lisa's phone now is, or better yet, where he disposed of her body?
There was a topic that came up. It was a pretty simple idea. What if we could somehow call Paul or text Paul, make it look like it's coming from Lisa, and then follow him and see what he did?
What's he going to do when he believes he's received a message from the grave? It might set him loose. When someone becomes panicked, they do things they otherwise wouldn't do. Fear is your friend when you're a policeman. Make someone afraid.
One of the ideas that Danny came up with was to clone her phone.
Interesting.
You buy a phone and you do a court order to that phone company saying, can you please transfer Lisa's telephone number to this brand new phone that we bought? And in essence, when I send a text, it would say, text from Lisa, from her cell phone.
My thought process, at least, was, let's give this a shot. What do we have to lose?
I've never seen any police agency try to pull what Miramar pulled in this case.
Over the course of my career, I have often tried to get in the minds of someone who I'm trying to catch. I often ask myself, if I were this person and this happened, how would I react? And in this case, I figured there's a few things that could happen. One, he could call me up and say, Detective Smith, I just got a text from her, she's fine. Or he could not do anything. And then lastly, he could get in his car and he could go somewhere. He could visit someone, someplace.
We were hoping these texts would prompt him to hopefully take us to the body.
When the time came to send that text message to Paul, I thought about her texting pattern.
The importance of the text being correctly done is the key. Wording it to match the voice of Lisa Spence is the thing that would drive the fear off the charts.
The text messages that went to Lisa's brother that supposedly came from Lisa actually had a lot of spelling errors. And I just went right along with that idea. And I wanted to have one word that is not grammatically correct. So it was my idea to type, "Just wait till I got better."
Not wait till I get better, just wait till I got better.
This is the moment of truth. Let's see if Paul takes the bait. This surveillance team is laying in wait to see what Paul does when he gets a text from the grave.
This idea of sending a text from a clone phone was, to use a football analogy, a Hail Mary. Did I think it was going to work? No, not even a little bit. Did I have to give it a shot? Yeah, absolutely.
I think that Smith's plan was brilliant. Do something different. Do something no one will expect. Smith's taking a chance.
We had aerial surveillance, vehicle surveillance.
We had basically our entire detective bureau in unmarked cars ready to go.
It was a massive operation.
We waited, and we waited until I started to get a little bit nervous because there was no movement. It was just radio silence.
In the first hour after the text is sent, nothing happens. The second hour comes and goes. But in the third hour, Edwards goes mobile. He gets in another rental car that he has, and he begins to drive. The surveillance kicks off, the helicopter spots the car, everything is working.
We wanted to see where he goes.
He was driving erratic. He was making some turns and then some U-turns again.
He does all the things people do when they're trying to see if they're being surveilled.
In an operation like this, I think one of the most important things is don't get made. Don't let him know that we're following him, that we are interested in where he's going, because that will defeat the purpose of everything we're trying to do.
Finally, he becomes convinced he's not being seen.
So at that point, it's a matter of writing down areas near where he was traveling that would be a great place to dump a body.
He passed by a number of vacant fields, a number of different areas with high grass or trees.
He went to many different places, but one of the places was an area in Miami Gardens, which is the city that is just south of us. He drove up to this residence, stopped briefly. We could see that he did speak to the person that was at that residence and turned around and left.
Well, we might as well go talk to this person.
She gave an interesting story.
So I was kind of surprised that he even showed up today.
She said that she was friends with Paul, and Paul was going to install an appliance, but she found it weird that Paul showed up at her house. She didn't have the appliance yet, and she didn't make those plans yet with him.
So they think that's kind of odd.
Hey, look at that field.
But at that moment, they look to the left of the place, and they see a vacant field.
So you have this bunch of big trees that are over there and junk.
It looks like a dumping ground. There's couches out there and tons of garbage.
It's a good place to hide something in plain view. Maybe it wasn't Edward's purpose to talk to this individual. Maybe it was his purpose to look at this field to make certain whatever he put there was still there.
We had put together a search team which was comprised of several detectives and also a cadaver dog.
I remember the Detective Bureau reaching out to me. They requested that I come out and utilize Canine Jewel.
Cadaver dogs are different than search dogs. They are trained to detect the odor of human remains. They will find a buried body with their nose.
Zeller and I arrived, and there was just this massive tree, I just remember, and there were vultures circling overhead. And I'll never forget the words he told me. He's like, I have a good feeling about this one.
I just had this feeling, don't ask me why, I had this feeling that this was going to be the spot.
And I just thought there was no way they were going to find anything here. We're talking about acres upon acres upon acres upon acres of land.
I remember this clear as like it was yesterday. As soon as he opened that door, that dog darted over to this big tree over there and sat down right there in front of a barrel.
Canine Jewel started going into changes of behavior to target odor.
And I'm like, oh my God, we have something here.
You really couldn't smell anything coming from it, but you just knew that, there was something else in there.
Whatever is in this barrel is human, or at least it was.
This barrel was a 55-gallon drum, and it's commonly used to transport goods. It was secured very well. It was about as close to airtight as it can get.
We had made the determination, it's best not to open it here. Let's have the barrel transported to the Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's office, and it would be opened over there. Saw them take the barrel out, and I saw them empty out the contents of the barrel. That'll be a day that I'll never, ever, ever, ever forget.
I have done this, and it is a very unpleasant affair.
The stench was something that I had never smelled before.
They pour out the contents of the drum. It contains the remains of a black female.
There was a lot of decomposition that was happening. The obvious injury was the decapitation. There was no head in the barrel, so it was just a body from the neck down.
We have 95% of a body, but not the last 5%.
It's important to now try to identify this person.
So there was a good indicator that this was probably going to be Lisa, but we couldn't be sure yet until we did the actual DNA testing.
John Zeller and I went down to Trinidad, and we took DNA swabs from Lisa's daughter, and we ultimately bring that back to our labs down here and then compared to the DNA from the body that was found in the barrel. When we get the lab reports back, we're able to determine that the body in that barrel is in fact Lisa Spence.
In the opinion of the medical examiner, the body had been dead for approximately 6 weeks.
There were minimum 33 stab wounds. This was personal.
You are stabbing them 33 times. You don't want to kill them. You want to punish them. They are responsible for your rage, and you're getting even every time you feel that blade go in their body.
My personal opinion, the amount of stab wounds, I believe put her to the point where she was almost decapitated. I do not believe that was done in order to get her in that barrel.
Whoever did this was some violent monster.
Once Lisa was identified, we go back to the blood that was collected from the rental car that Paul Edwards was driving, and that in fact came to Lisa Spence. The blood in the bathroom was also found to be blood belonging to Lisa Spence. At that point, we had enough to effect an arrest.
The evidence against Mr. Edwards is overwhelming. It's him, nobody else. It's just him.
It was satisfying to put the handcuffs on him and let him know verbally, you're under arrest. I was hoping that I could ask a number of questions that I wanted answers to.
But there's no possibility for that. Edwards immediately demands an attorney. He makes no statement.
He was taken to jail. It was simple and a very quick ending to a long investigation.
So one has to assume that certain things took place in that event that caused the untimely demise of Lisa Spence.
I believe that the crime occurred in the home shared by Paul and Lisa.
Lisa's family says Paul was a controlling boyfriend who demanded the presence of Lisa Spence 24 hours a day. And the time he left her alone was when she was at work.
And at some point, she had decided, to leave.
Based on the available evidence, the likely scenario is that Paul Edwards loses control. Rage fills up his mind. He throws her on the floor in the bathroom and attacks her with a knife and stabs her repeatedly, so much so her head falls off. The ultimate rage murder.
I believe that that barrel was once in their home, and it was a crime of opportunity.
So Lisa Spence wound up inside the barrel that was supposed to take money to her family and abandoned in a vacant field like so much garbage.
I think that's one of the things that bothers me most about where Lisa ended up. It's sad that her life was ended and she was disposed like garbage.
The matter goes to trial in the state of Florida, and the jury, in a period of only 3 hours, finds Paul Edwards guilty of murder in the first degree.
He stabbed her 30 times. You can't look at him and think there's a spark of a human being in here.
A judge sentences him to life in prison in the state of Florida.
Although the investigation ended with a positive result for investigators, we were still never able to find any of Lisa's belongings. We never found her phone, and quite frankly, we were unable to ever find where her head was. And that still to this day, I think, haunts all the investigators that worked that case.
These detectives did a remarkable job in this particular case because they looked outside the norm. Innovation often leads to results.
An evil man is now behind bars and will not hurt anybody ever again. Bottom line.
Lisa Spence, by all accounts, she was loved, well-liked, and I think that
the human mind possesses a frightening capacity to mask its own rot. We walk through life assuming that monsters carry a distinct weight, a visible shadow, or a jagged edge that warns us of their presence before they strike. We expect them to look like the nightmares we construct in our childhood bedrooms, malformed, lurking in the literal dark, instantly recognizable by their malice. But the most terrifying wolves are those who do not bother with sheep's clothing. They simply wear the face of the boy next door, the charming stranger who smiles as he holds the elevator door open for you, or the meticulously dressed accountant who speaks with absolute, soothing precision. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the vast, sprawling suburbs of Ontario, Canada, became the hunting ground for exactly this type of deception. It was a time when the quiet, tree-lined streets of Scarborough, a borough on the eastern edge of Toronto, still felt like a sanctuary where families could let their guard down, where children played until the streetlights flickered on, and where a late-night walk home from a transit stop was a routine, unremarkable act of independence. Yet, beneath that veneer of suburban peace, a predator was systematically dismantling the collective sense of safety, weaving a web of terror so dense that it transformed every shadow, every engine idling at a curb, and every footstep crunching on gravel into a harbinger of pure, unadulterated dread. Imagine the absolute stillness of a Canadian autumn night. The air is sharp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant, rhythmic hum of the Highway 401 traffic. A young woman steps off the municipal bus, her boots clicking softly against the concrete sidewalk. She pulls her coat tighter against the damp chill, looking ahead toward the warm, welcoming glow of her neighborhood street lamps. She feels entirely safe, grounded in the familiarity of a route she has walked hundreds of times before. But just beyond the radius of that light, tucked into the dense, overgrown brush of a ravine, a man is watching. He does not move with frantic urgency, his breathing is measured, his posture relaxed but hyper-focused. He has been waiting for hours, studying the schedules, calculating the intervals between buses, selecting his target not out of impulse, but with the cold, analytical detachment of a surveyor. He notes the way she looks down at her purse, the slight vulnerability in her stride, the absence of anyone else on the street. In his hand, the blade of a hunting knife catches the faint glint of the moon, cold and unyielding. As she passes the threshold of the shadow, he steps out. There is no dramatic warning, no theatrical villainy, just a sudden, crushing weight from behind, a hand smelling of cheap cologne and sweat clamping violently over her mouth, and a voice, terrifyingly calm and venomous, whispering directly into her ear that if she makes a single sound, she will die right there on the grass. This was the terrifying reality that came to define the Scarborough rapist cases, a calculated campaign of psychological and physical terror that left an entire region paralyzed. 4 years, this faceless entity operated with a chilling impunity, moving through the suburbs like a ghost that left behind a trail of shattered lives. The sheer cruelty of his method lay not just in the physical violation, but in the psychological warfare he waged against his victims. He didn't just assault them, he systematically stripped away their dignity, using verbal degradation as a weapon to ensure they felt entirely broken, entirely powerless. He would whisper horrific, degrading insults, forcing them to repeat statements of submission, all while holding a blade against their throat or a fist pressed into their temple. And when it was over, he would leave them shivering in the dirt, departing with the same quiet, unremarkable efficiency with which he arrived, vanishing into the suburban night as if he had never existed. The police were baffled, chasing whispers and generic descriptions of a handsome, well-groomed young man with blonde hair, a description so terrifyingly common that it applied to thousands of ordinary citizens, rendering the monster invisible in plain sight. But as the calendar turned toward the 1990s, this insatiable appetite for dominance began to mutate into something even more sinister. The thrill of the fleeting, chaotic assaults in the dark ravines of Scarborough was no longer enough to satisfy the darkness festering within him. A predator's evolution is rarely static, it demands higher stakes, total control, and an environment where his cruelty can expand without the ticking clock of a public space. What the world did not yet know was that this golden boy, this charming, fastidious accountant named Paul Bernardo, had found a partner who would not only witness his depravity but actively fuel it. Enter Carla Homolka, a beautiful, blonde young woman with a sweet disposition and a smile that seemed to radiate innocence. To the outside world, They were the quintessential Canadian dream, a couple so visually stunning, so perfectly matched in their ambition and attractiveness, that friends and neighbors affectionately dubbed them Barbie and Ken. They threw lavish parties, lived in a picturesque pink house in Port Dalhousie, and presented a front of blissful, aspirational romance. Yet, behind the closed doors of that picture-perfect home, the pink walls concealed a chamber of horrors that defies human comprehension. The fairy-tale wedding they celebrated was paid for with a currency of absolute sadism. The true horror of the Scarborough rapist saga lies in this transition from a solitary predator stalking the transit lines to a domestic partnership built entirely on the degradation, torture, and eventual execution of innocent young girls. Together, Bernardo and Homoka constructed an insular world where human life was treated as a disposable prop for their twisted fantasies. They didn't just stumble into evil, they planned it, documented it, and relished the absolute power they held over their victims. They brought the nightmare inside, transforming the sacred sanctuary of a home into a slaughterhouse where the screams of children were muffled by the music playing on the stereo upstairs. As we begin to peel back the layers of this dark tapestry, we are forced to confront the agonizing reality of how close justice came, yet how devastatingly it failed when it mattered most. We must look into the eyes of a system that was repeatedly handed the keys to stop the monster, only to let him slip through its fingers due to bureaucratic delays, technological limitations, and the sheer inability to believe that someone so beautiful could be so utterly monstrous. This is not merely a story of a crime, it is an exploration of the absolute limits of human malice, the vulnerability of innocence, and the profound, enduring scars left upon a community that realized, too late, that the devil doesn't always wear a horrific visage sometimes. He looks exactly like the person you trust most. Turn down the lights, steel your nerves, and prepare your mind, because we are about to step into the cold, damp shadows of a Canadian winter, down into a basement from which there was no escape, to uncover the full, unfathomable truth behind the Scarborough rapist and the chilling legacy of Canada's most notorious golden couple. To understand how a solitary predator stalking the dark ravines of Scarborough transformed into one half of Canada's most notorious killing team, we must step back into the bright, deceptively peaceful suburban landscape of the late 1980s. The township of Scarborough was growing rapidly, a sprawling collection of neat subdivisions, manicured lawns, and winding asphalt roads that promised young families a safe haven away from the urban grit of Toronto. It was a place where life was structured around the predictable rhythms of school schedules, community hockey games, and evening commutes. The geography itself, however, possessed a hidden vulnerability. Scarborough was carved up by a network of deep, heavily wooded ravines and parklands that ran like dark veins beneath the surface of the suburbs. These natural formations offered a stark contrast to the orderly rows of houses above them, providing a dense, unlit wilderness that sat just yards away from public transit stops and quiet residential sidewalks. It was within this specific architectural contrast, between the brightly lit safety of suburban domesticity and the pitch-black obscurity of the adjacent ravines, that the Scarborough rapist found his perfect laboratory for terror. The atmosphere in Scarborough between 1987 and 1990 was one of slow, suffocating paranoia. It began with whispers, small articles buried in the back pages of local newspapers detailing late-night assaults near the regional bus loops. A young woman would step off the night bus, her mind focused on the warmth of her home just a few blocks away, only to feel a sudden, violent shift in the air behind her. Before she could scream, a heavy arm would lock around her throat, the cold edge of steel would press against her skin, and she would be dragged down into the freezing mud of the ravine. The attacker operated with an eerie, clinical confidence that suggested he knew the terrain better than the residents themselves. He knew which street lamps were burned out, which paths were obscured by thick summer foliage or heavy winter snowdrifts, and exactly how many seconds he had to overpower a victim before a passing car might illuminate the scene. His cruelty was characterized by an intense, verbal sadism. He did not just seek physical compliance, but the total psychological annihilation of the women he trapped. He spoke in a low, controlled monotone, uttering horrific indignities, forcing them to endure prolonged psychological torture while constantly reminding them that their lives hung entirely on his whim. As the number of victims grew into the dozens, the psychological fabric of Scarborough began to unravel. Parents no longer let their daughters walk the short distance from the transit hubs alone. An unwritten curfew settled over the neighborhoods, and the sound of an approaching vehicle or a solitary footstep behind a pedestrian became a source of instant, heart-stopping panic. The local police, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of assaults and the lack of physical evidence, established a dedicated task force in 1988 known as Project_Rapist. Detectives logged thousands of tip sheets, interviewed hundreds of blonde, athletic young men who matched the vague descriptions provided by traumatized survivors, and flooded the transit routes with undercover officers. Yet, the predator remained entirely invisible. He was a master of compartmentalization, capable of leaving a scene covered in the mud and sweat of a brutal assault, changing his clothes in a parked vehicle, and returning to his ordinary life without raising a single suspicion among his peers. That ordinary life was centered around a young man named Paul Bernardo, who appeared to be the very definition of suburban success. Born and raised in a fractured, dysfunctional household in Scarborough, Bernardo had learned early in life how to weaponize his appearance. He was strikingly handsome, with carefully styled blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a confident, magnetic smile that exuded charm and privilege. He dressed fastidiously, preferring tailored clothes and an immaculate, clean-cut aesthetic that immediately disarmed anyone he met. He attended the University of Toronto, earning a degree in economics and commerce, and eventually secured a respectable position as an accountant. To his classmates and colleagues, Bernardo was an ambitious, articulate golden boy destined for wealth and status. They saw a polite, charismatic young man who was popular with women and highly driven to succeed in the corporate world. No one who crossed his path could have imagined that beneath this polished, corporate exterior lay a profound psychological vacancy, a vacuum of empathy that he filled with an insatiable craving for absolute dominance and sexual sadism. Bernardo viewed the world through a lens of cold calculation. People were not sentient beings to be respected, but objects to be manipulated, controlled, and used for his personal gratification. In October of 1987, this calculating predator met his matching piece in a hotel lobby in St. Catharines, Ontario. Carla Homocka was just 17 years old, a beautiful, petite blonde with wide, innocent eyes and a sweet, gentle demeanor that made her popular in her hometown. She was working at a local veterinary clinic, surrounded by animals, and possessed a public reputation for kindness and vulnerability. When Bernardo approached her, she was instantly captivated by his glamorous, older man aura, his expensive car, and the intense, undivided attention he bestowed upon her. For Bernardo, Homocka was a revelation. He did not just see a beautiful young woman, he recognized an intensely malleable personality, someone whose deep-seated insecurities and desire for validation could be exploited to serve his darkest impulses. Their relationship developed with a rapid, suffocating intensity, evolving into a mutual obsession that friends and family viewed as a textbook fairytale romance. They were a visually perfect couple, standing out in any crowd like a living manifestation of a fashion magazine advertisement, a pairing so pristine that those around them began calling them Barbie and Ken. The reality behind the closed doors of their shared spaces, however, was a descent into a shared pathology. Bernardo began to systematically erode Homocka's boundaries, introducing violent pornography, demanding total submission, and gradually exposing her to his twisted sexual fantasies. Instead of recoiling, Homocka became increasingly complicit, her desire to please Bernardo and maintain the illusion of their perfect, enviable life overriding any residual moral compass. She did not merely tolerate his escalating darkness, she absorbed it, becoming an active participant in an insular, domestic echo chamber where the suffering of others became their ultimate binding ritual. The transition from Bernardo acting as a lone, opportunistic predator on the streets of Scarborough to the couple operating as a coordinated, predatory unit was seamless and terrifying. They began to plan their crimes together, discussing the procurement of victims with the same casual, organized detachment they used to plan their upcoming, lavish wedding. By the winter of 1990, the pink-painted house they occupied in the historic village of Port Dalhousie had become a fortress of absolute cruelty. The world outside saw a young, beautiful couple decorating their home for the holidays, hanging lights, and preparing for a bright future together. But inside, the air was thick with a heavy, unspoken malice. Bernardo's appetite had outgrown the random, rushed encounters of his past. He demanded absolute ownership over a victim, an extended timeline of control that could only be achieved within the confines of his own home. Homocka, fully integrated into this nightmare, was ready to deliver the ultimate sacrifice to ensure her partner's satisfaction, even if it meant destroying her own flesh and blood. The stage was set for an escalation of violence that would shatter the collective consciousness of a nation, as the golden couple prepared to bring their first victim across the threshold of their domestic paradise. Proving that the most profound evil often resides in the places that look the most beautiful. To truly comprehend the depth of the tragedy that befell the province of Ontario in the early 1990s, we must step away from the shadows of the predators and look directly into the light of the young lives they extinguished. The true measure of a crime's horror is not found in the cleverness or the cruelty of the perpetrator, but in the vibrant, beautiful realities of the victims, realities that were filled with laughter, ambition, family traditions, and ordinary teenage milestones before they were violently cut short. These were not statistics, nor were they abstract characters in a tragic script. They were daughters, sisters, best friends, and students who left behind empty chairs at dinner tables, unmade beds in bedrooms that would remain frozen in time, and communities that would never fully heal from the loss. To honor their memory, we must look at who they were when they were alive, celebrating their humanity before confronting the darkness that claimed them. The first life to be consumed by the escalating darkness within the Pink House in Port Dalhousie belonged to Tammy Homocka. At just 15 years old, Tammy was a bright, lively girl who was deeply loved by her family and peers. She was the younger sister of Carla, but where Carla was meticulous, highly controlled, and obsessed with appearances, Tammy possessed a more spontaneous, carefree energy. She was navigating the beautiful, often chaotic transition of early adolescence, finding her footing at Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School in St. Catharines. Tammy was known for her infectious smile, her loyalty to her friends, and an innocent warmth that drew people toward her. She looked up to her older sister, viewing Carla's relationship with the handsome, wealthy Paul Bernardo as a real-life fairy tale. She trusted them implicitly, seeing their home as a place of safety and excitement, completely unaware that her innocence was viewed by Bernardo not with respect, but as the ultimate prize to be stolen. Tammy's life was an open book of potential, filled with the ordinary joys of a teenage girl living in a tight-knit Canadian community, making her eventual betrayal by those of her own blood an act of unfathomable cruelty. A few months after Tammy's tragic disappearance from the world, the shadow fell upon another family in the nearby city of Burlington. Leslie Mahaffey was only 14 years old, a girl whose life was defined by a passionate, creative spirit and a fierce desire for independence. Leslie was an avid competitive diver, spending hours training at the local pool, her body moving with grace and discipline that won her numerous medals and the admiration of her coaches. She loved music, fashion, and spending time with her friends, possessing that vibrant, slightly rebellious teenage spark that often tests the boundaries set by worried parents. She was a daughter who filled her home with noise, laughter, and the constant hum of teenage energy. On the night of June 15, 1991, Leslie attended the funeral of a close friend who had died in a tragic accident, an emotional experience that left her shaken and seeking the comfort of her peers. She stayed out past her curfew, a minor infraction born of grief and teenage stubbornness, which led to her being locked out of her family's home for the night. As she stood on her own front lawn in the quiet, damp darkness of the early morning hours, waiting and trying to figure out how to get inside without waking her parents, she was completely vulnerable, a young girl whose only crime was an ordinary moment of teenage lapse. Unaware that a predatory wolf was cruising the quiet suburban streets looking for an opening. The final innocents to be targeted by the deadly duo belonged to Kristen French, a 15-year-old girl from St. Catharines who embodied everything that was wholesome, driven, and bright about her generation. Kristen was a star student at Holy Cross Secondary School, where her academic achievements were matched only by her leadership qualities and her deep commitment to her community. She was a member of the school's rowing team, a demanding sport that required immense physical stamina, teamwork, and an early morning dedication that she met with unwavering enthusiasm. Kristen was also a talented ice skater, a girl who moved across the ice with a natural elegance and a bright, radiant confidence. Beyond her athletic and academic pursuits, She was a member of the school choir, her voice contributing to the harmony of a community that adored her. Kristen was known for her mature, compassionate nature. She was the kind of friend who listened deeply, the kind of daughter who left sweet notes for her parents, and a girl who possessed a strong, innate sense of right and wrong. On the afternoon of April 16, 1992, Easter Thursday, Kristen was walking home from school, her mind likely occupied with thoughts of the upcoming holiday weekend and her studies. She was just a short distance from her home, walking along a familiar, brightly lit sidewalk lined with houses and passing cars, completely secure in the belief that her community was a safe place, when the pink car pulled up beside her, changing the course of Canadian history forever. These three young girls represented the very best of their communities, the promise of the future, the warmth of family bonds, and the innocent joy of youth. They were loved fiercely, protected by parents who did everything within their power to raise them in a safe, nurturing environment. The profound tragedy of their stories lies in the absolute randomness of their selection, the fact that they were targeted simply because they happened to cross paths with an entity that lacked a human soul. As we prepare to examine the horrific events that unfolded, we must carry the weight of these three young lives with us, remembering that behind every piece of evidence, every court transcript, and every headline, there are the shattered fragments of three beautiful souls who deserved to grow old, to achieve their dreams, and to live lives free from the terror that found them in the quiet heart of Ontario. The descent from predatory harassment into cold-blooded, collaborative murder began in the depths of a Canadian winter, inside a household that was supposed to be preparing for a joyful family celebration. It was December 1990, the night before Christmas Eve, a time when the Homocide family home should have been filled with the warm sense of holiday baking, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the soft, comforting glow of tree lights. Instead, a plot of unthinkable domestic betrayal was unfolding in the shadows. Paul Bernardo had expressed a dark, obsessive desire for Carla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy, and rather than reacting with horror or protective rage, Carla agreed to facilitate the violation of her own flesh and blood as an ultimate Christmas gift to her partner. The mechanism of their betrayal was clinical and precise. Working together in the kitchen, they prepared a sedative, mixing a lethal cocktail of prescription tranquilizers and animal sedatives obtained from the veterinary clinic where Carla worked, crushing the pills into a drink that they handed to the unsuspecting teenager. As the powerful narcotics took hold, Tammy became deeply unconscious, slipping into a helpless stupor in her own bedroom. What followed was a prolonged, horrific assault orchestrated by Bernardo while Carla stood by, assisting and documenting the violation. The physical toll of the massive dose of sedatives on Tammy's young body was catastrophic. While completely unresponsive and unable to defend herself, her system began to fail, causing her to aspirate and choke in her sleep. When the couple realized that Tammy was no longer breathing, panic set in, but it was a panic born of self-preservation rather than remorse. They cleaned the room, removed the evidence of the drugs, and called emergency services, staging the scene to look like a tragic, accidental medical emergency. When paramedics arrived at the home, they found a family in apparent mourning, and due to the lack of visible external trauma and the trusted medical background of Carla, the initial post-mortem examination concluded that Tammy had tragically choked on her own vomit due to an undiagnosed medical condition or accidental asphyxiation. The monsters had gotten away with their first domestic execution, and the successful cover-up only served to embolden their sense of absolute invincibility. 6 months later, the predatory hunger returned with a ferocious intensity that could no longer be contained by opportunistic encounters. On the humid night of June 15, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey found herself locked out of her Burlington home after missing her curfew following a friend's funeral. As she stood on the dark, quiet lawn, trying to figure out how to slip inside without waking her parents, a sleek, dark car glided silently to the curb. Bernardo and Homocide had been cruising the quiet residential streets, hunting for a solitary target. Seeing the vulnerable teenager alone in the shadows, Bernardo stepped out of the vehicle, using his polished charm and non-threatening appearance to close the distance before Leslie could realize the danger. In a flash of sudden, overwhelming Luke, he shoved a knife against her throat, stifling her screams, and forced her into the back seat of the car where Carla was waiting. They drove back to their pink house in Port Dalhousie, crossing the threshold into a domestic chamber of horrors from which Leslie would never emerge alive. For the next 2 days, the basement of that picturesque home became a living nightmare for the young girl. Leslie was bound, stripped, and subjected to systematic physical and psychological degradation. Bernardo and Homocka treated her not as a human being, but as a piece of property, recording her suffering on a video camera to preserve the moments of absolute dominance for their future enjoyment. Leslie pleaded for her life, talking about her family and her desire to go home, but her tears were met with cold, clinical detachment and further violence. On the second day, realizing that they could never release her without exposing their identities, Bernardo wrapped an electrical cord around her neck and strangled her to death while Carla assisted in holding her down. The depravity did not end with her death. To obliterate the evidence, Bernardo took Leslie's body into the basement workshop, using a circular saw to dismember her remains. He then packed the body parts into large plastic tubs, filled them with wet cement, and drove out to the secluded waters of Lake Gibson, dropping the heavy blocks into the deep, dark water, believing that the concrete would keep their secrets buried forever. The final crescendo of their collaborative madness occurred in the spring of 1992, on the afternoon of Easter Thursday, April 16. 15-year-old Kristen French was walking home from school along a busy, familiar sidewalk in St. Catharines when a light-colored car pulled up alongside her. Carla Homocka leaned out of the passenger window, holding a map and projecting an aura of sweet, helpless confusion as she asked the young student for directions. It was a calculated trap designed to exploit Kristen's natural kindness and maturity. As Kristen stepped closer to the vehicle to look at the map, Bernardo bolted from the driver's seat, grabbing the girl from behind and violently forcing her into the car in broad daylight, driving away before anyone in the quiet neighborhood could comprehend what they had just witnessed. Kristen was taken back to the same basement sanctuary of terror, but unlike the victims before her, Kristen possessed a fierce, resilient spirit that refused to be easily broken by her captors. During her 3 days of captivity, Kristen was subjected to the same horrific ritual of video-recorded abuse and torture that Leslie had endured, including being forced to watch the footage of Leslie's torment to break her psychological resolve. Yet, even in the face of absolute malice, Kristen maintained a profound dignity, looking directly into the lens of the camera and confronting her captors, refusing to give them the total, broken submission they craved. This resistance infuriated Bernardo, whose ego demanded complete control. On the third day, as the pressure of the intense police search for the missing schoolgirl began to mount outside, Bernardo decided to terminate the fantasy. He forced Kristen to her knees, tied a yellow telephone cord tightly around her neck, and strangled her until her breathing stopped. The couple then undertook a meticulous cleaning process, cow-trock dow Kristen's head and scrubbing her body with bleach to destroy any traceable DNA evidence before driving her lifeless body to a remote, muddy ditch in North Burlington. Abandoning her in the cold earth as they returned home to wash the blood from their hands and prepare for their upcoming Easter dinner with family. The illusion of the perfect crime began to crack under the weight of a summer heatwave, as the waters of Lake Gibson refused to hold the dark secrets Bernardo and Homocka had cast into their depths. On June 29, 1991, just 2 weeks after 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey vanished from her front yard, a routine afternoon of boating transformed into a horrific forensic discovery. 2 local fishermen, drifting near the shoreline where the water was thick with reeds and murky sediment, noticed an unusual shape submerged just beneath the surface. It was a massive, heavy block of concrete, crude and irregular, but protruding from the hardened grey mass was a fragment of black plastic that looked entirely out of place in the natural environment. As they drew closer, the unmistakable, sickening odor of biological decay cut through the humid summer air, prompting an immediate, panicked call to the regional authorities. When police divers descended into the gloomy, cold depths of Lake Gibson, they uncovered a sight that would haunt the recovery teams for decades. Submerged in the mud were multiple concrete blocks, each one a hastily constructed tomb designed to obliterate a human life. The recovery operation was slow and agonizingly precise, requiring heavy machinery to hoist the dense blocks out of the water and onto the flatbed of a police transport vehicle. Investigators from the Ontario Provincial Police and forensic pathologists converged on the local morgue, where the grim task of extracting the remains from the concrete began. Using chisels and small hammers to avoid damaging the underlying evidence, forensic technicians carefully cracked open the blocks, revealing the dismembered, badly decomposed remains of a young female. The level of calculated brutality shocked even the most veteran homicide detectives. The body had been systematically severed using a high-powered saw, a detail that immediately pointed to a killer who possessed a chilling level of emotional detachment and anatomical confidence. Through dental records and a distinctive piece of jewelry that had survived the submerged burial, the medical examiner confirmed the identity that everyone had dreaded: the remains belonged to Leslie Mahaffey. The discovery sent a shockwave of grief and absolute panic through the community of Burlington, transforming a missing persons case into a high-priority homicide investigation that demanded the mobilization of every available forensic resource. As the police struggled to find a single thread connecting Leslie's life to her killer, the nightmare expanded into the neighboring region of St. Catharines. On April 30, 1992, exactly 2 weeks after Kristen French was snatched from her peaceful sidewalk, a motorist pulling off to the side of a remote, unpaved rural road in North Burlington spotted something unusual in a deep, muddy ditch. Tucked beneath the overgrown weeds and damp spring foliage was the lifeless body of a young woman, abandoned in the dirt like a discarded object. The responding officers secured the perimeter with yellow crime scene tape, creating a wide buffer zone to protect the fragile outdoor scene from contamination by the gathering media. The physical state of the body revealed a perpetrator who was evolving in his methods, becoming increasingly obsessed with forensic countermeasures. Kristen's body was entirely nude, her skin cold and translucent against the dark earth, and in a detail that chilled the investigators to the bone, her beautiful long hair had been completely shorn off, leaving her scalp bald and covered in superficial abrasions. The forensic examination of the ditch and Kristen's body became a meticulous, square-inch search for a microscopic calling card left by the killer. Pathologists noted that the body had been thoroughly scrubbed, smelling faintly of a chemical disinfectant that suggested a deliberate attempt to wash away any traceable biological evidence. The cause of death was quickly determined to be ligature strangulation, with deep, purple furrow marks encircling her neck that matched the diameter of a standard electrical or telephone cord. The severity of the bruises on her wrists and ankles confirmed she had been bound tightly for an extended period before her death, indicating a prolonged captivity that shifted the investigation from an opportunistic street attack into a highly organized abduction scenario. Despite the killer's efforts to sanitize the body, the forensic team hit a critical breakthrough during the post-mortem examination. Using specialized alternate light sources and meticulous vacuuming techniques on the body and the surrounding grass, technicians recovered several tiny, microscopic fibers. These fibers were unique. They were trilobal nylon carpet fibers dyed in a specific, uncommon shade of pinkish purple, along with several foreign hairs that did not belong to the victim. The forensic lab determined that these fibers were characteristic of an automobile interior or a specific type of residential carpeting manufactured within a very limited time frame. At the same time, the autopsy of Kristen French provided another vital clue that linked her death directly to the ongoing hunt for the Scarborough rapist. Seminal fluid recovered from the victim was rushed to the Center of Forensic Sciences, where preliminary testing indicated genetic markers that were highly consistent with the profile compiled from the victims who had survived the attacks in Scarborough years earlier. The terrifying truth was now undeniable to the leadership of the task force: the ghost who had terrorized the transit lines of Toronto's suburbs had migrated, grown bolder, and was now hunting, capturing, and systematically executing young girls in the heart of Ontario's Niagara region. Leaving behind a trail of microscopic fibers and an elite team of investigators who were racing against time to decipher the clues before another child disappeared into the dark. The investigation into the disappearance and brutal murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French quickly became one of the largest, most convoluted manhunts in Canadian history, turning into a massive bureaucratic machine that ironically ground to a halt under its own weight. Following the discovery of Kristen's body in the spring of 1992, the police formed a massive, multi-jurisdictional task force known as Green Ribbon Task Force, combining the resources of the Ontario Provincial Police, the Toronto Police, and regional departments from Niagara and Halton. The command centre was a chaotic landscape of ringing telephones, dry erase boards covered in overlapping timelines, and filing cabinets bursting with over 20,000 tips from a terrified public. Detectives were operating in a state of high-octane exhaustion, fueled by stale coffee and the haunting knowledge that a highly organized predator was living among them. Yet, despite the unprecedented mobilization of manpower, the investigation repeatedly ran into frustrating dead ends and structural blind spots that allowed the killer to remain entirely unbothered. The primary obstacle facing the Green Ribbon Task Force was the sheer volume of data and the lack of a centralized, computerized cross-referencing system, which was still in its technological infancy at the time. Information was stored on physical index cards and separate local databases that did not easily communicate with one another. This fragmentation meant that critical connections were missed. For instance, eyewitnesses near the scene of Kristen French's abduction had reported seeing a light-colored, metallic beige or gray Chevrolet Camaro or Pontiac Firebird idling in the area, a vehicle that stood out in the quiet suburban neighborhood. This valuable tip led officers to log thousands of similar vehicles across the province, tracking down owners, checking alibis, and creating a massive sub-investigation that consumed weeks of valuable time. Detectives spent hundreds of hours interviewing young men who owned sports cars, looking for anyone with a history of violence or a connection to the geographic areas where the victims disappeared. Paul Bernardo owned exactly this type of vehicle, a gold-colored Chevrolet Camaro, and his name was actually submitted to the task force multiple times by concerned citizens and even by his own acquaintances who noted his creepy behavior and his uncanny resemblance to the composite sketches of the Scarborough rapist. In fact, the system failed catastrophically when investigators actually crossed paths with Bernardo during routine field checks. Because his name was buried deep within the unorganized mountain of paperwork, he was treated as just another low-priority lead. When detectives briefly interviewed him, Bernardo used his formidable charm, his professional status as an accountant, and his immaculate, well-dressed appearance to entirely disarm them. He smiled warmly, answered their questions with practiced ease, and offered a seamless, logical explanation for his whereabouts, projecting the aura of an upstanding, cooperative citizen who was just as shocked by the local tragedies as everyone else. The investigators, looking for a stereotyped, disheveled monster who lived in the margins of society, could not reconcile their mental image of a sadistic killer with the polite, attractive young man standing in front of them. They checked his name off their immediate list, failing to dive deeper into his background or demand an immediate biological sample. This oversight was compounded by a devastating delay in the processing of forensic DNA evidence. Although semen samples had been successfully recovered from the victims of the Scarborough rapist cases years prior, and a new sample had been secured from the body of Kristen French, Canada's forensic laboratories were severely bottlenecked. DNA profiling was a lengthy, expensive, and relatively new science in the early 1990s, requiring months to yield conclusive results. The task force had established a strict prioritization hierarchy for DNA testing, and because Bernardo did not have a prior criminal record for sexual assault, his sample, which he had eventually been forced to provide during a subsequent secondary sweep of suspect vehicles, sat in a backlog at the Center of Forensic Sciences, waiting for its turn to be analyzed. 4 months, the very key to unlocking the entire mystery, the definitive genetic link that would connect the golden boy of Port Dalhousie to the horrors of the Scarborough ravines and the deaths of the young girls. Sat undisturbed in a cardboard box on a laboratory shelf while detectives continued to chase thousands of useless, dead-end leads across Ontario. As the months dragged on into late 1992 without an arrest, a suffocating sense of defeat began to permeate the command center. The public's initial cooperation turned into frustration and anger, with the media openly criticizing the task force for its perceived incompetence. Rumors flew wildly through the communities, with false leads suggesting the killings were the work of an international satanic cult, a rogue trucker traveling the Trans-Canada Highway, or a highly placed government official whose identity was being protected by a high-level cover-up. Every weekend, psychic hotlines flooded the police tips line with visions of shallow graves and hidden basements, forcing weary officers to waste precious days driving out to remote fields and abandoned barns, only to find nothing but dirt and empty space. The investigation had hit a monumental psychological brick wall. The trail had gone cold, the public was losing faith, and the Green Ribbon Task Force was drowning in a sea of uncoordinated data, completely unaware that the monster they were hunting was comfortably sitting in his pink house. Watching the evening news reports about his own crimes with a sense of smug, absolute superiority, believing he had built a fortress of deception that no detective could ever penetrate. The immaculate facade of the golden couple began to fracture from within, proving that the most fortified bastions of malice are often destroyed by the volatile nature of their own creators. By the close of 1992, the domestic environment inside the Pink House in Port Dalhousie had mutated into a battlefield of psychological and physical terror directed toward Carla Homolka herself. Paul Bernardo, whose ego had been inflated by his ability to evade the Green Ribbon Task Force, became increasingly unstable, shifting his insatiable need for total dominance toward his wife. The shared secrets that had once acted as a twisted glue for their relationship became a weapon of domestic torment. Bernardo subjected Homolka to severe physical assaults, face-breaking strikes, and absolute isolation from her family, culminating in a brutal attack in January of 1993 that left her severely bruised, bloody, and terrified for her own survival. Realizing that the monster she had helped cultivate was now turning his lethal sights upon her, Homolka fled the Pink House under the cover of darkness, seeking refuge in the protective embrace of her parents and a local hospital. This domestic rupture became the catalyst for the monumental breakthrough that years of police work had failed to achieve. In February of 1993, accompanied by a high-profile defense attorney, Homolka approached the authorities with a narrative that would completely upend the deadlocked investigation. She presented herself to the Crown prosecutors as a deeply traumatized, battered woman who had been brainwashed, physically coerced, and held hostage by a psychopathic husband. She claimed that she had been forced to participate in the abductions and assaults of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French under the immediate threat of death. To secure her cooperation and unlock the secrets of the unsolved murders, the prosecution, desperate for a conviction and unaware of the full extent of her depravity, offered her what the Canadian public would later denounce as the deal with the devil. In exchange for her detailed testimony against Paul Bernardo, Homolka was permitted to plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter, securing a capped sentence of just 12 years in prison, ensuring she would one day walk free. With Homolka's official statement in hand, the legal machinery moved with explosive velocity. On February 17, 1993, tactical police units swarmed the Pink House in Port Dalhousie, arresting Paul Bernardo in his driveway. While Bernardo sat in a cold interrogation room maintaining a smug, silent composure, forensic teams dismantled his house brick by brick, searching for the physical evidence that would validate Homolka's horrific timeline. For weeks, the search yielded frustratingly little, as Bernardo's fastidious cleaning habits had eliminated most surface traces. The true turning point, however, did not come from the structural elements of the house, but from a hidden compartment that Bernardo's own defense lawyer, Ken Murray, had discovered during an independent walkthrough of the property prior to police seizure. Hidden behind a loose drywall panel in the ceiling of the downstairs bathroom was a stash of videotapes, 6 full hours of recorded material that Bernardo had kept as trophies of his absolute conquest. The eventual recovery and viewing of these hidden videotapes shattered the prosecution's understanding of the case and exposed the profound error of the plea deal they had just signed with Homolka. When forensic analysts played the tapes in a secure facility, the images on the screen revealed a reality that was infinitely more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The tapes did not show a trembling, coerced victim forced to participate at knife point. Instead, the lens captured Carla Homolka acting as an enthusiastic, highly active, and entirely voluntary co-conspirator. The footage showed her smiling, laughing, and initiating acts of profound cruelty against the bound and terrified schoolgirls. Most devastatingly, the tapes provided the undeniable proof of the murder of Tammy Homolka, showing Carla actively administering the lethal sedatives and holding her sister down while Bernardo assaulted her. The tapes revealed that the innocence Homolka had projected to the prosecutors was a masterful piece of sociopathic acting. While the legal team reeled from the realization that they had given a mass murderer a lenient sentence that could no longer be rescinded due to constitutional protections, the final, unassailable piece of the forensic puzzle fell into place at the center of forensic sciences. The DNA sample that had been extracted from Bernardo months prior during the routine vehicle sweep was finally processed through the bottlenecked system. The genetic markers matched with absolute, mathematical certainty. The DNA found in the body of Kristen French, the biological materials recovered from Leslie Mahaffey, and the decades-old samples preserved from the cold case files of the Scarborough rapist were an identical match to Paul Bernardo. The faceless ghost who had haunted the transit lines, the shadow in the ravines, and the killer of Ontario's daughters was no longer a mystery. Armed with the irrefutable science of DNA and the self-incriminating horror of the videotapes, the state prepared to bring the golden boy into the blinding light of a courtroom, setting the stage for a judicial confrontation that would transfix a nation. The summer of 1995 brought a sweltering, suffocating heat to the city of Toronto, but the atmosphere inside the Ontario Court of Justice was colder than ice as the trial of Paul Bernardo finally commenced. The courtroom became a theatre of the grotesque, packed to maximum capacity every single day with grief-stricken family members, stone-faced journalists, and a public that had grown deeply traumatized by the drip-feed of horrific revelations in the media. Bernardo sat in the prisoner's box, dressed in an immaculate, tailored suit, his hair neatly coiffed, looking more like a young executive preparing for a corporate presentation than a man accused of orchestrating a campaign of sadistic slaughter. Throughout the entire proceeding, he maintained a chilling, detached composure, occasionally smirking at the media gallery or whispering casually to his defense counsel, displaying a complete lack of remorse that horrified those in attendance. The prosecution began its case by systematically laying out the physical and forensic reality of Bernardo's crimes, creating a mountain of evidence that left no room for doubt. The emotional core of the trial arrived when the infamous videotapes, recovered from the ceiling of the Port Dalhousie bathroom, were introduced into evidence. Because the contents of the tapes were so intensely graphic and degrading, the presiding judge ruled that the video monitors would be turned away from the public gallery and the media, allowing only the jury, the lawyers, and the judge to view the actual footage. The impact on the courtroom, however, was visceral. As the audio track played through the headsets, the heavy, agonizing sounds of the victims' whimpers, their desperate pleas for their mothers, and the cold, mocking laughter of Bernardo and Homocka filled the silent room. Members of the jury wept openly, clutching tissues, their faces twisted in profound disgust, while several hardened court officials had to look away from their screens to compose themselves. The tapes stripped away any lingering shred of Bernardo's defense, exposing his absolute sadism in high-definition clarity and cementing his fate long before the closing arguments were even delivered. The trial reached a boiling point of public fury when Karla Homocka took the witness stand to testify against her former husband as part of her plea agreement. Now known to the public as an active participant rather than a helpless victim due to the recovered footage, Homocka's presence in the courtroom was met with a wall of palpable hatred. She dressed conservatively, speaking in a soft, monotone voice as she recounted the mechanics of the abductions, the drugging of her own sister Tammy, and the final moments of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Bernardo's defense team launched a ferocious cross-examination, attempting to dismantle her credibility by forcing her to confront her own enthusiastic actions on the videotapes. Painting her as a calculating sociopath who was using Bernardo to escape the full consequence of her own murderous desires. The courtroom watched in grim fascination as the two former lovers, the once celebrated Barbie and Ken, turned on each other with venomous intensity, each trying to shift the ultimate blame for the deaths of 3 young girls onto the other. On September 1, 1995, after a grueling trial that had pushed the Canadian judicial system to its absolute limits, the jury returned with its verdict. The courtroom was so quiet that the rustle of the foreperson's paper echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, and the historic charges related to the Scarborough rapist cases. The judge, in delivering the sentence, did not hold back his utter loathing for the man standing before him, describing Bernardo as an unmitigated monster who had forfeited his right to walk among civilized humanity. Bernardo was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, but the most critical component of the sentence was the judge's decision to officially designate him as a dangerous offender. This legal label ensured that even after his 25-year minimum was served, the state would have the power to retain him in maximum security confinement indefinitely, effectively ensuring that he would draw his last breath behind bars. Justice had finally spoken with a heavy, unyielding gavel, but for the families sitting in the front rows, the verdict was a hollow victory against a darkness that had already taken everything from them. When the echoes of the heavy wooden gavel finally faded from the Toronto courtroom, a profound, heavy silence settled over the entire province of Ontario. The legal machine had completed its slow, grinding work, locking Paul Bernardo away in a maximum security cell where he would spend the rest of his natural life surrounded by concrete and steel, a forgotten ghost fading into the margins of the penal system. For the families of Tammy Homocka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French, however, there was no magical sense of closure, no sudden lifting of the grief that had rewritten the fabric of their lives. The true aftermath of a tragedy of this magnitude is not measured by the efficiency of a prison sentence, but by the quiet, enduring empty spaces left behind, the bedrooms that remained exactly as they were on the days the girls disappeared, the high school graduations that were never celebrated, and the weddings that would never take place. The communities of Scarborough, Burlington, and St. Catharines were forever changed, stripped of that unique, innocent belief that the quiet streets of suburban Canada were completely immune to the absolute darkest impulses of the human soul. The legacy of the Scarborough rapist and the Ken and Barbie killers forced a painful, systematic re-examination of the institutions designed to protect the public. The profound failures of the Green Ribbon Task Force, the uncoordinated communication, the bureaucratic bottlenecks in processing DNA evidence, and the inability to recognize a predator because he was hidden behind a handsome face and an expensive suit, became a watershed moment for law enforcement across North America. It spurred massive structural reforms, leading to the creation of centralized, computerized suspect tracking systems and a revolution in forensic sciences that ensured biological evidence would never again sit processing on a laboratory shelf while a killer continued to hunt. Yet, the most agonizing scar left upon the collective Canadian consciousness remained the miscarriage of justice surrounding Karla Homocka, whose 12-year sentence for manslaughter allowed her to walk out of prison as a free woman in 2005. The public's lingering fury over her release stands as a permanent reminder of the limitations of human justice. A reminder that the legal system can sometimes be manipulated by a clever sociopath who knows exactly how to weaponize the narrative of victimization to escape the full consequence of her depravity. As we look back at the dark path forged by Paul Bernardo and Karla Homocka, we are left with a chilling, vital lesson about the true nature of evil. It does not always announce itself with a monstrous visage or a dramatic shadow. It does not lurk exclusively in the terrifying margins of society where we comfort ourselves by thinking it belongs. True malice is entirely capable of dressing fastidiously, earning a university degree, buying a beautiful house, and smiling warmly as it greets you on a bright suburban sidewalk. The story of the Scarborough rapist is a powerful warning to look beyond the surface, to recognize that the most dangerous monsters are those who can seamlessly mirror our own humanity back at us while harboring a vacuum of empathy within their souls. But more importantly, the enduring legacy of this tragedy must always belong to the young women whose lives were stolen. We must remember the vibrant, brilliant spirits of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen, their laughter, their academic dreams, their athletic passions, and the profound love they brought to their families. By refusing to let their memories be entirely eclipsed by the shadow of the monsters who harmed them, we keep their light alive, ensuring that even in the wake of the deepest darkness, innocence, dignity, and remembrance will always have the final, unyielding word. The story of the Scarborough rapist and the victims he claimed does not truly end when the prison doors slide shut or when the final legal document is filed away into the archives of the court. The true weight of this history continues to ripple outward, acting as a permanent anchor in the collective memories of the cities that were touched by this extraordinary malice. In the quiet corners of St. Catharines and Burlington, the passing of decades has not erased the phantom presence of the three young girls who should have grown into adulthood, pursued careers, and raised families of their own. Instead, their absences have become a quiet, structural part of those communities, felt every time a new school year begins, every time a rowing team takes to the water at dawn, and every time the winter snow blankets the rural ditches where the search teams once knelt in the frozen mud. The families left behind have carried a cross of unimaginable weight, converting their immense, lifelong grief into a quiet, dignified resilience that stands as the ultimate antithesis to the chaotic destructiveness of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This case permanently altered the psychological architecture of modern parenting and public safety across the nation, drawing a sharp, historical line between the innocent, trusting eras of the mid-20th century and the heightened, hypervigilant realities of the modern age. The simple act of a teenage girl walking home from a transit loop or chatting with a stranger who appeared to be lost became a source of permanent, hardwired suspicion. Yet, out of that profound loss of innocence, a new kind of community solidarity emerged. Foundations were established in the names of the victims, scholarship funds were created to support young women pursuing higher education, and public awareness campaigns regarding personal safety and the psychological dynamics of domestic abuse were radically transformed. These initiatives ensured that the names of Kristen French, Leslie Mahaffey, and Tammy Homolka would not merely be synonymous with a dark chapter of true crime history, but would remain permanently associated with the values of compassion, community protection, and the preservation of youth. Ultimately, the enduring narrative of the Scarborough rapist cases serves as a sobering reminder of the limits of human comprehension when faced with absolute, unmitigated psychopathy. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some individuals are born with or develop a profound void where human empathy is supposed to reside, a void that cannot be healed by social intervention or explained away by conventional logic. But while Bernardo remains locked in his maximum security cell, fighting a futile, cyclical battle for parole that the justice system repeatedly and decisively denies, the true victory belongs to the collective refusal of society to forget the light of the innocent. The monsters sought to entirely possess, degrade, and erase these young women, to turn them into disposable instruments for their own fleeting, sadistic gratification. By continuing to speak their names, by remembering who they were before the shadow fell upon them, and by honoring the profound dignity they maintained even in their final, terrifying moments, we ensure that the final victory belongs to the victims, leaving the perpetrators to rot in the absolute obscurity and insignificance they so richly deserve. As the chronological distance from the horrific events of the late 1980s and early 1990s continues to widen, the case of the Scarborough rapist transitions from a living, breathing community trauma into a chilling case study studied by criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars around the globe. This historical distance allows for a colder, more analytical examination of the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such an extraordinary anomaly of human malice to flourish in an otherwise peaceful society. Experts in criminal behavior often point to Paul Bernardo as the textbook definition of the malignant narcissist and sexual sadist, an individual whose external charm was not a mask that he occasionally wore, but an integral part of his predatory mechanism. The study of his evolution, from a lone, opportunistic offender operating under the cover of the suburban ravine network to a highly organized domestic serial killer, has fundamentally reshaped modern understanding of how sexual predators escalate their violence when left unchecked by early judicial intervention, providing vital data that helps modern behavioral analysis units identify similar patterns before they reach a lethal crescendo. At the same time, the complex and deeply disturbing psychology of Karla Homolka continues to challenge traditional understandings of domestic complicity and female criminality. The case shattered the comfortable, societal myth that women are inherently incapable of orchestrating or actively participating in extreme acts of sexual sadism and violence against other females. Criminologists continue to debate the precise nature of the dynamic between Bernardo and Homolka, examining whether she was a classic victim of coercive control who succumbed to the overwhelming psychological conditioning of a psychopathic partner, or an active sociopath in her own right whose latent sadistic desires were awakened and amplified by her relationship with Bernardo. The existence of the videotapes ultimately settled the legal question of her active participation, but the underlying psychological mystery remains a dark, fascinating subject of study, reminding the field of forensic psychology that human behavior is infinitely complex and capable of descending into shared pathologies that defy simple, black-and-white categorization. Beyond the academic and investigative realms, the societal impact of the case serves as a permanent testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute devastation. The families of the victims, by refusing to allow their lives to be entirely defined by the horrific actions of two broken individuals, demonstrated an extraordinary strength that inspired a nation. Their ongoing advocacy for victims' rights, their participation in legal reforms regarding parole eligibility for dangerous offenders, and their quiet, dignified presence at every subsequent judicial hearing ensured that the voice of the innocent would never be drowned out by the sensationalism of the media. They forced a system that is often cold and bureaucratic to look directly into the eyes of the human cost of violent crime, ensuring that the memory of what was lost would remain a guiding priority for future generations of lawmakers and citizens alike. In the final analysis, the shadow of the Scarborough rapist cases serves as a permanent, solemn monument to vigilance, empathy, and remembrance. It reminds us that while we must remain clear-eyed about the existence of absolute malice in the world, we must also match that awareness with an unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable and honoring those who were taken. The names of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka will forever be associated with a dark, cautionary tale of human depravity, but they are ultimately just footnotes in a history that truly belongs to the beautiful, vibrant young lives they tried to destroy. By keeping the memory of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French alive, society achieves a quiet, permanent victory over the darkness, proving that love, dignity, and collective remembrance are ultimately more powerful and enduring than the most profound evil. The ripples of this case eventually crossed the Atlantic, prompting international law enforcement networks to fundamentally reconsider the global framework for tracking highly mobile, affluent serial offenders who utilize clean-cut professional identities to shield their transnational or domestic travels. Throughout the late 20th century, Interpol and various federal intelligence agencies began integrating the hard-earned lessons of the Green Ribbon Task Force into their specialized training curriculums for homicide investigators across Europe and the Americas. The critical realization that a corporate accountant could double as a brutal predator stalking municipal transit loops shifted the traditional investigative paradigm away from focusing solely on individuals with marginalized socioeconomic backgrounds or existing criminal records. This global shift in behavioral profiling led to the development of sophisticated algorithmic threat assessment models designed to analyze anomalies in patterns of missing persons reports and unsolved sexual assaults across distinct geographic boundaries, thereby minimizing the risk of multi-jurisdictional communication failures ever again, shielding a highly calculating predator from swift apprehension. Simultaneously, the intense media circus that enveloped the 1995 trial triggered a profound ethical revolution within the field of journalism and true crime broadcasting. The realization that the sensationalized reporting of Bernardo's horrific crimes had inadvertently granted him the perverse, ego-stroking notoriety he desperately craved caused major news syndicates to establish strict internal guidelines regarding the coverage of active criminal proceedings. The industry began moving away from the breathless, sensationalist coverage that frequently transformed sadistic killers into dark celebrities, choosing instead to pioneer a more ethical, victim-centric approach to investigative journalism. This modern framework prioritizes the preservation of the victim's humanity, focusing extensively on the structural failures that allowed the crime to occur and the profound systemic impact on the surviving families, rather than dwelling voyeuristically on the graphic mechanics of the violence itself. This shift ensured that future generations of media consumers would be educated on the realities of criminal psychology without contributing to the psychological gratification of the perpetrators. Within the Canadian legal architecture, the enduring legacy of the case manifested as a permanent barrier against the premature release of individuals deemed inherently incompatible with public safety. The institutional memory of the outrage surrounding Karla Homolka's release in 2005 acted as a powerful judicial catalyst, influencing subsequent statutory amendments that made the criteria for securing parole or statutory release exponentially more stringent for individuals convicted of multi-victim violent offenses. The parole board hearings for Paul Bernardo, which recur with bureaucratic regularity every few years, have become a solemn, national ritual where the state repeatedly reaffirms its unyielding commitment to the safety of its citizens. At each hearing, the overwhelming consensus of psychological evaluators confirms that his core pathology remains entirely unmitigated, resulting in the swift, decisive rejection of his petitions and reinforcing the absolute permanence of his dangerous offender designation. In the ultimate reckoning, the true narrative of the Scarborough rapist cases is not one of a predator's triumph, but a testament to the absolute failure of evil to permanently extinguish the human spirit. The profound darkness that Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka attempted to inflict upon the world was ultimately met by an overwhelming, generational wave of community resilience, legislative reform, and an unbreakable commitment to collective memory. The Pink House in Port Dalhousie was eventually demolished, its physical foundations obliterated from the earth to ensure that no monument to their cruelty could ever endure. What remains instead are the living, breathing legacies of the families who survived, the improved laws that protect modern neighborhoods, and the permanent, luminous remembrance of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their names continue to shine with an unassailable brilliance, serving as a timeless beacon of hope and strength that completely eclipses the forgotten, decaying shadows of the monsters who sought to destroy them. The deep, institutional memory of the Scarborough rapist cases also initiated a profound technological transformation within the global forensic ecosystem, driving advancements that would eventually change the way cold cases are investigated across the world. In the decades that followed Bernardo's conviction, the raw genetic material gathered from those dark Ontario ravines and preserved by forward-thinking technicians became the foundation for pioneering research in advanced DNA sequencing. The limitations of early restriction fragment length polymorphism testing, which had caused the catastrophic multi-year delays during the initial manhunt, were systematically replaced by short tandem repeat analysis and mitochondrial DNA testing. These newer, highly sensitive methods allowed forensic labs to generate complete genetic profiles from microscopic, degraded, or decades-old biological samples that previously would have been deemed completely useless. This technological leap directly traced its urgency back to the failures of the Green Ribbon Task Force, ensuring that future investigators could instantly match crime scene data against national offender registries, completely eliminating the bureaucratic waiting periods that had allowed Bernardo to slip through the dragnet. As this new forensic era unfolded, the growing integration of geographic profiling systems revolutionized the tactical deployment of law enforcement assets during active serial investigations. The precise mapping of the Scarborough assaults, analyzing the spatial relationships between the victim drop-off points, the transit schedules, and the eventual attack sites, became a textbook template for developing predictive software used by modern police departments. Behavioral geographers used the data from Bernardo's early hunting patterns to demonstrate how serial offenders establish a comfort zone or an anchor point, usually tied to their place of residence or employment, from which they gradually expand their predatory perimeter. By studying how Bernardo utilized the ravine geography of Scarborough as a natural cloaking mechanism, modern crime analysts learned to look beyond traditional administrative boundaries, identifying how physical environmental features can be exploited by an organized predator to evade local police jurisdictions. Simultaneously, the profound societal shockwaves from the case led to an unprecedented evolution in the support systems available to victims of sexual assault and their surviving families. The agonizing public spectacle of the 1995 trial exposed the immense psychological toll that the traditional adversarial judicial process inflicts upon those who are left to pick up the pieces of a violent crime. In response, legal advocates and grassroots organizations across Canada successfully campaigned for the formal implementation of victim impact statements, granting families an institutional voice during the sentencing and parole phases of a trial. This legislative shift ensured that the human cost of a crime would remain at the very center of the judicial calculation, forcing judges, juries, and parole board members to directly confront the lifelong devastation experienced by the survivors before making any determinations regarding an offender's freedom or institutional status. In the final estimation, the historical narrative of the Scarborough rapist cases serves as a permanent, solemn reminder that the true strength of a society is measured by its capacity to learn, adapt, and protect its most vulnerable members from the anomalous forces of human depravity. The physical landmarks of the crimes have been systematically reclaimed by nature and community development, the transit stops have been modernized, the ravines are now filled with the footsteps of peaceful hikers, and the community structures have been reinforced by decades of protective vigilance. The names of the perpetrators continue to diminish into the sterile, heavily guarded confines of maximum security history, stripped of their power and their vanity. What endures instead is the collective, unyielding promise of a society that refuses to let the light of its lost daughters be forgotten, transforming a historical nightmare into a timeless blueprint for resilience, justice, and the eternal preservation of human dignity. The profound evolution of the criminal justice system in the wake of the Scarborough rapist investigation also had a significant and lasting impact on the field of correctional psychology and the long-term management of high-risk psychopathic offenders within the federal prison network. Prior to the exposure of the full extent of Paul Bernardo's depravity, institutional rehabilitation programs were often designed with the optimistic assumption that even the most severely antisocial individuals possessed a core capacity for behavioral correction if provided with the appropriate cognitive therapy and structural counseling. However, the comprehensive psychological evaluations conducted on Bernardo during his initial incarceration and repeated continuously throughout his decades behind bars forced a radical paradigm shift among correctional experts. These intensive assessments revealed an individual completely devoid of any capacity for genuine remorse, empathy, or self-reflection, demonstrating instead a highly sophisticated ability to weaponize behavioral therapy techniques to mimic rehabilitation while maintaining an unaltered, deeply entrenched matrix of sexual sadism and narcissistic entitlement. This realization led to the development of highly specialized institutional protocols designed to manage dangerous offenders not through the unrealistic expectation of rehabilitation, but through rigorous, long-term risk containment and behavioral monitoring, ensuring that the safety of the public would never again be compromised by the manipulative charm of a master manipulator. Concurrently, the historical documentation of the case became an invaluable baseline for studying the dark phenomenon of shared psychopathy, or folia dux, within romantic partnerships. Academic researchers specializing in criminal behavior began to look deeply into the psychological dynamics of the Pink House in Port Dalhousie to understand how an otherwise conventional domestic relationship could mutate into a collaborative machinery for torture and homicide. This ongoing analysis has yielded critical insights into the subtle, progressive stages of grooming, psychological erosion, and mutual reinforcement that occur when a primary sociopathic predator encounters a highly dependent, similarly unprincipled partner. By understanding how Bernardo and Homocka systematically dismantled each other's moral boundaries, modern threat assessment teams are better equipped to recognize the early warning signs of domestic pairs who pose an escalating risk to their communities, allowing for proactive interventions before their shared dark fantasies transition into irreversible physical violence against innocent third parties. On a broader cultural level, the memory of the Scarborough rapist cases catalyzed an enduring transformation in the way Canadian society engages with the concept of public safety and neighborhood solidarity. The realization that a horrific predator could operate with absolute impunity in the very heart of affluent, picturesque suburbs dismantled the old, complacent myth that geographical or economic isolation could provide a permanent shield against the forces of human depravity. In the decades that followed, communities across the nation moved away from a culture of passive isolationism toward one of active, organized vigilance. Neighborhood watch programs were modernized, municipal infrastructure was redesigned to eliminate poorly lit blind spots near public transit corridors, and educational systems integrated comprehensive personal boundaries and safety curriculums designed to empower young people to recognize and report suspicious behaviors without fear of dismissal or bureaucratic inaction. This systemic awakening transformed a historical legacy of deep vulnerability into a timeless blueprint for collective strength, ensuring that the modern suburban landscape would be defined not by the fear of the dark, but by the unyielding, protective light of community solidarity. In the final, ultimate accounting of this dark chapter in history, the true narrative remains a testament to the absolute failure of evil to achieve its ultimate goal of permanent erasure. The profound darkness that Paul Bernardo and Karla Homocka sought to inflict upon the world was completely overwhelmed by a generational wave of legal reform, scientific breakthrough, and an unbreakable commitment to the preservation of human dignity. The physical traces of their crimes have been methodically erased from the earth, leaving behind a society that is vastly more vigilant, interconnected, and dedicated to the protection of its daughters. The names of the perpetrators continue to fade into the sterile, heavily guarded archives of criminal history, stripped of their vanity, their youth, and their freedom. What remains instead, shining with an unassailable, eternal brilliance, is the living memory of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their legacies continue to serve as a timeless beacon of hope, resilience, and strength, proving that even in the wake of the most profound malice, a society's capacity for love, justice, and collective remembrance will always have the final, unyielding word. The deeper psychological autopsy of the Scarborough rapist case eventually forced researchers to re-examine the concept of the criminal mask, moving beyond the superficial traits of charm and looks to analyze the linguistic patterns and administrative habits of high-functioning predators. For years during his initial campaign of terror along the transit routes, Paul Bernardo did not just rely on the darkness of the ravines, he relied on his absolute fluency in the language of normalcy. As an accountant, his mind was trained to look for patterns, to audit risks, and to find the most efficient pathways to achieve a specific outcome without leaving a trail. When he spoke to his victims, and later when he interacted with the police, he used a structured, hyper-rational vocabulary that completely contradicted the chaotic, emotionally volatile profile that investigators traditionally associated with serial rapists. This meticulous linguistic control allowed him to compartmentalize his life with a frightening degree of success, stepping out of a corporate office where he managed complex financial portfolios and directly into a hidden staging ground where he planned the systematic destruction of human autonomy. The realization that an individual could possess such a high level of technical, professional competence while harboring a completely disintegrated moral core led to an overhaul of executive and corporate screening processes within high-security industries. Establishing behavioral assessments designed to detect the subtle, underlying markers of psychopathy that traditional background checks and academic credentials frequently fail to uncover. At the same time, the historical trajectory of the case sparked a critical, long-overdue evolution in the way forensic psychiatry approaches the concept of sadism within incarcerated populations. Prior to the high-profile trials of the mid-1990s, sexual sadism was often viewed by the general psychiatric community as a secondary symptom of a broader personality disorder rather than a distinct, unyielding clinical entity. The extensive video documentation left behind by Bernardo, combined with his subsequent institutional behavior, provided definitive, tragic proof that true sexual sadism operates as a primary, self-reinforcing drive that grows more entrenched with every successful expression. Correctional psychologists learned that for a predator of this classification, the infliction of pain and psychological torment is not merely a means to an end, but the ultimate objective itself. This clinical realization led to the implementation of strict, lifelong supervision protocols for individuals demonstrating even minor markers of sadistic behavior, completely changing parole risk assessment formulas to ensure that any individual possessing this specific incurable pathology would remain permanently isolated from the general public, regardless of their superficial compliance with institutional rules or institutional programs. On a societal level, the long-term aftermath of the case inspired a profound movement focused on the reclamation of public spaces by the communities that had been paralyzed by fear. In Scarborough, the very ravines that had once been weaponized by the predator were systematically transformed by grassroots environmental and civic organizations. Urban planners and community leaders worked together to clear away overgrown brush, install extensive trail lighting, and create vibrant, high-visibility public parks that invited families, runners, and hikers back into the natural spaces. This physical transformation carried a deep symbolic weight, representing a collective refusal to let a historic predator permanently dictate the geography of a neighborhood. By transforming the hunting grounds of the Scarborough rapist into spaces of recreation, health, and community life, the citizens achieved a profound, multi-generational victory over the legacy of fear. Proving that a community's shared commitment to light and solidarity can systematically reclaim and sanitize even the darkest corners of its history. In the final, ultimate reflection on this monumental chapter of criminal history, the true narrative remains a testament to the absolute failure of malice to achieve a permanent legacy of terror. The profound darkness that Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka sought to establish within the walls of their pink house was completely obliterated by a generational wave of scientific breakthrough, legal reform, and community resilience. The physical structures of their crimes have vanished, leaving behind a society that is exponentially more vigilant, legally protected, and unified in its defense of the innocent. The names of the perpetrators continue to shrink into the heavily guarded, historical margins of the penal system, stripped of their youth, their vanity, and their freedom. What remains instead, burning with an unassailable, eternal brilliance, is the living memory of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their legacies continue to serve as a timeless beacon of strength and hope, proving that even in the wake of the most profound human depravity, a society's capacity for love, justice, and collective remembrance will always hold the final, unyielding word. The profound administrative and legal shockwaves generated by the Scarborough rapist case eventually forced a structural reorganization of how high-profile trial documentation and sensitive forensic evidence are preserved and secured within the global judicial infrastructure. The critical revelation that the definitive evidence of the crimes, the 6 hours of hidden videotapes, had been withheld from the police for months by Bernardo's initial defense counsel under the guise of solicitor-client privilege created a massive ethical and constitutional crisis within the Canadian legal establishment. This crisis prompted the Law Society of Upper Canada and corresponding international legal bars to enact strict, groundbreaking amendments to the ethical boundaries governing defense attorneys who come into possession of physical fruits or instrumentalities of a violent crime. The modern statutes established that while a lawyer is bound to protect the confidentiality of a client's verbal admissions, they cannot act as a repository for physical evidence that could prevent the ongoing destruction of human life or actively obstruct a homicide investigation. This landmark shift closed a dangerous legal loophole, ensuring that the integrity of public safety and the swift delivery of justice would always take precedence over the tactical concealment of evidence by defense teams. Simultaneously, the long-term historical analysis of the case has provided invaluable insights into the systemic vulnerabilities inherent in early multi-jurisdictional law enforcement efforts before the advent of modern interagency digital networks. The tragic reality that Bernardo was interviewed twice by individual detectives who failed to connect his identity to the broader Project Rapist databases because the cross-referencing files were managed on physical index cards became a permanent warning icon in police academy curriculums across the world. This catastrophic failure was the direct catalyst for the development of major modern intelligence sharing protocols, such as Canada's 6-class, Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, and the United States VICAP, which utilize advanced centralized algorithms to instantly link the behavioral, geographical, and forensic signatures of violent crimes occurring across entirely different municipal borders. By ensuring that a single investigator's notes are instantly accessible to homicide units nationwide, these modern systems have completely eliminated the localized blind spots that sophisticated predators historically exploited to maintain their invisibility in plain sight. On a deeper cultural level, the enduring legacy of the case manifested as a profound movement focused on the absolute preservation of victim identity in the digital age, creating a shield for the surviving families against the voyeuristic nature of modern true crime consumption. The families of the victims fought a fierce, historic legal battle to ensure that the graphic videotapes recorded by the perpetrators would never be released into the public domain or exploited for commercial entertainment, leading to precedent-setting judicial bans that permanently sealed the materials in high-security government vaults. This defensive victory established a critical legal framework for the modern digital era, protecting the privacy and basic human dignity of crime victims against the threat of digital exploitation and ensuring that the public record would remain focused on structural lessons and judicial accountability rather than the voyeuristic details of human suffering. In the final, absolute accounting of this monumental chapter in criminal history, the true narrative remains a powerful testament to the failure of evil to secure a lasting monument of terror. The immense darkness that Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka sought to establish was systematically disassembled by a generational wave of legal reform, scientific evolution, and unbreakable community solidarity. The physical spaces associated with their crimes have been entirely reclaimed, leaving behind a society that is exponentially more vigilant, structurally protected, and unified in its defense of the innocent. The names of the perpetrators continue to shrink into the sterile, heavily guarded archives of history, stripped of their vanity, their youth, and their freedom. What remains instead, burning with an unassailable, eternal brilliance, is the living memory of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their legacies continue to serve as a timeless beacon of hope and resilience, proving that even in the wake of the most profound human depravity, a society's capacity for love, justice, and collective remembrance will always hold the final, unyielding word. The systemic fallout from the Scarborough rapist investigation extended deeply into the field of public transit safety and the architectural design of urban transport corridors across Canada. In the late 1980s, the Predator's reliance on the predictable schedules of municipal buses and the isolating geography of transit drop-off points exposed a critical vulnerability in how public infrastructure accommodated nighttime commuters, particularly young women traveling alone. Following the resolution of the trials, transit authorities in major metropolitan areas launched a comprehensive, multi-million-dollar safety overhaul known as the Request Stop program. This initiative legally empowered passengers traveling at night to request a stop at any point along a transit route closer to their final destination, rather than being forced to disembark at designated, poorly lit bus loops that sat adjacent to dark ravines or unmonitored parklands. This simple yet revolutionary operational shift dismantled the precise predictable conditions that Paul Bernardo had meticulously audited and exploited during his early hunting campaign, fundamentally integrating the lessons of victim vulnerability into the daily mechanics of municipal engineering and public safety. Concurrently, the historical documentation of the Green Ribbon Task Force's missteps became a primary catalyst for an institutional revolution in the methodology of police interrogations and the psychological training of frontline detectives. For years, the law enforcement community had relied heavily on intuitive, unstructured interview techniques that were easily subverted by high-functioning psychopathic offenders who possessed advanced verbal skills, corporate confidence, and a disarming physical appearance. Bernardo's ability to effortlessly charm investigators during his initial field interviews provided stark, tragic proof that traditional, aggressive, or superficial questioning methods were entirely inadequate when dealing with individuals who lacked a functioning human conscience. In response, police training academies developed highly structured, cognitively grounded interrogation models, such as the PEACE method, which prioritize the meticulous gathering of objective, verifiable facts and the strategic disclosure of evidence over the pursuit of a theatrical confession. This modern framework trains detectives to look past the deceptive veneer of social privilege and professional status, focusing instead on objective behavioral anomalies and micro-expressions that even the most practiced sociopath cannot entirely conceal. On a broader legislative level, the deep national scar left by the case initiated a major reassessment of how statutory definitions of violent crime account for the compounding trauma of psychological terror and prolonged unlawful confinement. Prior to the trial, the legal system often evaluated criminal acts primarily through the lens of immediate physical trauma, frequently failing to fully codify the devastating, lifelong impact of systemic psychological degradation and forced captivity. The agonizing details of the 3-day confinements of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French inside the Port Dalhousie basement forced legal architects to draft new, heavily reinforced criminal statutes that dramatically increased the mandatory minimum penalties for abductions that involve elements of sexual sadism and psychological torture. These legislative amendments ensured that the judiciary would possess the explicit statutory power to issue maximum penalties that reflect the totality of a victim's suffering, ensuring that no future perpetrator could ever receive a mitigated sentence by attempting to separate the physical violence from the psychological warfare that preceded it. In the ultimate, absolute reflection on this monumental chapter of history, the true narrative remains an unassailable testament to the failure of evil to secure a lasting monument of terror. The immense darkness that Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka sought to establish was completely disassembled by a generational wave of architectural reform, scientific evolution, and unbreakable community solidarity. The physical landscapes associated with their crimes have been entirely transformed, leaving behind a society that is exponentially more vigilant, structurally protected, and unified in its defense of the innocent. The names of the perpetrators continue to shrink into the sterile, heavily guarded archives of history, stripped of their vanity, their youth, and their freedom. What remains instead, burning with an unassailable, eternal brilliance, is the living memory of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their legacies continue to serve as a timeless beacon of hope and resilience, proving that even in the wake of the most profound human depravity, a society's capacity for love, justice, and collective remembrance will always hold the final, unyielding word. The institutional memory of the Scarborough rapist investigation eventually catalyzed a profound transformation within the operational doctrines of search and rescue operations and missing persons protocols across the nation. Prior to the early 1990s, when a teenager vanished from a suburban neighborhood, law enforcement agencies frequently operated under the systemic assumption that the individual was a runaway, a cognitive bias that often resulted in a critical, multi-day delay before the full mobilization of investigative assets occurred. The agonizing timelines of the abductions of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French shattered this bureaucratic complacency, demonstrating with tragic clarity that a highly organized predator could operate with such swift, absolute violence that every hour wasted on administrative assumptions directly compromised a victim's chances of survival. In direct response to these systemic failures, police leadership developed and implemented immediate response frameworks that mandated the instant, high-priority classification of missing youth cases whenever the circumstances diverged from ordinary behavioral patterns. This rapid deployment doctrine paved the way for the eventual integration of coordinated public alert mechanisms, ensuring that the entire eyes and ears of a community could be instantly weaponized to close the net around a fleeing vehicle long before a suspect could transport a victim to a hidden staging ground. Simultaneously, the extensive forensic data generated by the tracking of Bernardo's movements provided a seminal foundation for the emerging academic discipline of behavioral crime linkage analysis. Investigators and criminologists realized that while Bernardo altered his physical tactics as he escalated from opportunistic ravine assaults to coordinated home abductions, his underlying psychological signature, his specific methods of verbal degradation, his fastidious cleaning habits, and his need for absolute control remained entirely consistent. By documenting these unalterable behavioral threads, researchers at the Center of Forensic Sciences developed highly complex behavioral matrices that could isolate the hidden commonalities between seemingly unrelated offenses across entirely different jurisdictions. This analytical methodology trained a new generation of homicide detectives to look past the surface differences of separate crime scenes, focusing instead on the underlying psychological needs of the offender, thereby dismantling the traditional geographic advantages that mobile, calculating predators historically relied upon to maintain their anonymity. On a deeper institutional level, the fallout from the case prompted an unprecedented evaluation of the psychological support and mental health care available to the first responders and forensic technicians who are tasked with processing scenes of extreme depravity. The immense psychological toll of processing the concrete blocks from Lake Gibson and analyzing the 6 hours of hidden videotapes left deep, enduring scars on the detectives, pathologists, and court officials who were forced to confront the unvarnished reality of Bernardo and Homocka's sadism. This crisis led to the formal establishment of mandatory, comprehensive critical incident stress management programs within federal and regional police forces, ensuring that law enforcement personnel would no longer be expected to internalize the trauma of their work in silence. This systemic shift recognized that protecting the mental well-being of those who hunt monsters is an essential component of maintaining the integrity of the justice system itself. In the final, ultimate accounting of this dark chapter in history, the true narrative remains a powerful testament to the failure of evil to secure a lasting monument of terror. The immense darkness that Paul Bernardo and Karla Homocka sought to establish within the walls of their pink house was completely dismantled by a generational wave of tactical reform, scientific evolution, and unbreakable community solidarity. The physical spaces associated with their crimes have been entirely transformed, leaving behind a society that is exponentially more vigilant, structurally protected, and unified in its defense of the innocent. The names of the perpetrators continue to shrink into the sterile, heavily guarded archives of history, stripped of their vanity, their youth, and their freedom. What remains instead, burning with an unassailable, eternal brilliance, is the living memory of Tammy, Leslie, and Kristen. Their legacies continue to serve as a timeless beacon of hope and resilience, proving that even in the wake of the most profound human depravity, a society's capacity for love, justice, and collective remembrance will always hold the final, unyielding word.